All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so happy that you're all here with us today. My name is Jennifer Morse, and I am with MadCap Software, and I am so excited to start this webinar in this session today. So what we're going to talk about today is all about usability testing for your products and documentation, an extremely important exercise and piece of the entire content management lifecycle. So traditionally, usability testing often falls into the hands of different departments, maybe those on the user experience team. However, technical writers, content strategists, content developers, courseware developers, whatever you call yourself, you are user advocates as well. And as writers, even though you may not be close to the design of the product, you are even more equipped to write a usability test than most product designers that you might be working with. So today, I am so thrilled and honored to welcome Leah Catania, content strategist and fellow Flarian at TraceLink, who will walk us through how to plan and run a usability test on MadCap Flare and best practices she has learned along the way. We'll also learn how usability testing can provide valuable insight into your documentation's information architecture, formatting, and overall clarity. So welcome, Leah. So thrilled to have you join us today and share some of these insights. I'm so excited. Two quick items of business before I turn it over to you, Leah, and we jump right in. Number one, as always, this webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending out a link to everybody that's registered when it's done. So not to worry if you have to pop out early. Also, would encourage you to check out the question panel and the GoToWebinar control panel console interface. That's a great place to ask questions along the way. We're going to do our best to get to questions at the end. Whenever we don't get to live, we'll follow up with a question and answer document. So Leah, I know you have so much to cover. I want to welcome you again. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited to be sharing my knowledge of usability testing with you all today. So as Jen said, I'm an associate content strategist at TraceLink. Before that, I was a senior technical writer, and I have over 5 years of experience as a technical writer for both Oracle and TraceLink, where I've been writing software documentation for the health sciences. I've studied usability as part of my master's degree. I worked with a user researcher at Oracle, and I've helped lead TraceLink's usability research efforts for the last 4 years, while I've been continuing to further my education with online classes and the attendee conference. So really, usability has been a pet project of mine and something that I have been interested in for a very long time. As Jen said, I'm going to talk to you today about usability through a tech writer's lens, and how it's a little bit different from a UX designer. So we have different priorities and understandings of our audience, and usability testing documentation can be very different from usability testing products. There are definitely situations where if you go to a UX designer who's used to usability testing their products and ask, how would you usability test this documentation, they might not have the best answer for you because it's not something they've ever done before. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about what is usability testing for those of you that are not familiar with it. We're going to talk about the types of usability tests, the writer's role in usability testing, and usability testing documentation. And then we'll get into how to plan and run a usability test and how to write a test plan, a script, and scenarios, because that's where we can bring some of our most valuable skills to the usability testing process. And we'll also go over some best practices for moderating and how to analyze results. So kind of soup to nuts. Hopefully we'll be able to get through this all, but I wanted to kind of give you guys a overview of the whole process and how you can take part and help. So first off, what actually is usability testing? Essentially, it measures how effectively and efficiently users can actually use your product or documentation. So it provides feedback before the product has actually been developed, or it can provide feedback. You can obviously usability test at any stage in the process, but possibly its most valuable place is before it's been developed, because this will save your company money in the long run. And this is often a place where you can make the argument for usability testing in that it does save money in the long run. And part of that goes back to the studies that have shown that behavioral patterns are extremely consistent from person to person, unlike something that's more subjective, like marketing research, where people are telling you, what they like and what they don't like. So this means that you can conduct a study with 6 to 8 participants, or even less, as low as 5 participants, because even a trend across 3 people is enough to extrapolate to a larger user group when you are looking at those behavioral patterns. So it can actually be a lower cost and a lower effort than a lot of executives think it will be, and that will save you money once the product is being developed, to make sure that you're doing it with all of the right choices behind you. However, in order to do it effectively, you need to make sure that the participants represent real users and perform real tasks. So this goes back to, you need to make sure you're doing your user research, know who your users actually are and what they actually need to do. Because if you're going to the time and effort and expense of conducting a usability test, you don't want to find out later that the tasks that you tested aren't things that your participants actually want to do with your product. And usability testing, it provides both qualitative and quantitative data. So the qualitative data comes from the things that you observe in your participants, what they say, how they feel about what they're doing. And then the quantitative data comes from the pass-fail metrics on the tasks themselves and any questions that you ask that kind of give a definitive answer, like if you're asking how easy was this on a scale of 1 to 5 to complete this task, that can give you a specific metric that is quantitative, especially if you're trying to compare things with each other. So for types of usability tests, you need to make sure you're looking at the goals of what you want to accomplish when you decide what kind of usability test you want to run. So depending on where you are in the design process, there are a couple of different tests that you can run. First off, we have walkthroughs. This is the earliest test that you can run because it can be done with limited prototypes that can even be printed on paper or even hand drawn by your designers. They don't need to be high fidelity or even medium fidelity. They can be very, very low fidelity and limited prototypes. These are used to gather more general feedback because it's not functional. So you can't usually ask them to complete a specific task. So you can't get that pass-fail metric, but you can get feedback on conceptual designs and other things like that. So something like, can they find the area on the screen that you want to have the button, or something like that. Then we have formative tests. So these are tests run with clickable prototypes or demo products. So they are usually medium to high fidelity mockups that are involved, and either you're having your designer set up the prototypes so that users can actually click on things and walk through a scenario, or you might have a demo product set up by development that they can play around in. So the purpose of this test generally focuses on qualitative feedback and think aloud feedback, which is a concept in usability testing that you might hear a lot, especially through the rest of this presentation. And think aloud is basically when you ask participants to talk out loud about the actions that they're taking, the decisions they're making, and anything else that they're thinking as they go through each task. And it can provide you with a lot of valuable information about what's going on inside their head that you can't otherwise get. These tests can also include quantitative metrics like the ideal number of clicks or the first element clicked on, and pass-fail metrics. However, they don't focus on time spent on task yet. The product isn't fully functional, so that slows people down, and it doesn't represent a real-world use case. And thinking out loud can also slow people down. Summative tests are the last test we have here. These are run with fully functional products. Often people run these on existing products to set benchmarks. So say you're planning a redesign of your UI, and you know where the general problem areas are, but you want to make sure that you can prove to your stakeholders that the redesign was worth the time and effort and expense it took. So you conduct a usability test on the original UI to set the benchmark for this is how long it takes people to complete these tasks. This is the pass rate for the current product. This is the qualitative feedback we have on the current product. And then you can conduct that exact same usability test later on the redesigned product to say, this is how we compare it to the benchmark of the original design. This is how much better we're doing now. This proves the value and worth of the redesign. So as I just mentioned, these do typically measure the time on task, and therefore they don't ask participants to think out loud. However, you can choose to prioritize the qualitative feedback from the Think Aloud protocol over the time on task metric. That's something you need to decide when you're kind of coming up with your goals. What's more important to you for the goals of this usability test? So basically, just to kind of wrap it up, we want to make sure that you're taking the stage of the design and the goals for your test into consideration when you choose the type of usability test. And you also want to make sure that a usability test is actually the best use of your time and effort. Sometimes the goals for what the PO or the designer want to get out of the test are actually better aligned with an alternative user research method, like card sorting, tree tests, or user interviews. And going to the full effort of a user test isn't necessary. And that's something you always want to take into account. I'm not going to go into the details of the alternative research methods, but you can definitely go look those up. There's a ton of information out there on usability.gov and Nielsen Norman and a host of other resources about card sorting, tree tests, and everything else involved with user research. So what is your role in the usability testing process as a technical writer? One thing to keep in mind, and what I often find is the best way to kind of get in on the ground floor with this, is that writers are often the product's first users, even before QA. We're looking at designs in tandem with the PO and the UX designer, and we're getting ready to write our documentation, and we're trying to walk through, okay, how would we write a procedure for doing this task? And that's where we can often come across things that are confusing or difficult to document. And that can be a place where you can say, hey, I think this is confusing. This might be worth testing, especially if the UX designer and the PO are kind of really close to the product and they don't think that it's going to be confusing. And you're not sure if that's because they're just too close to the design itself. User testing can be a really great way to kind of suss that out. Writers are also involved enough to understand the product and the design, but they're removed enough from the process of designing it itself to be more objective than the designer or the PO. This is really important. You want to make sure that the way the scenarios are written, the way the moderator speaks, the way the moderator reacts, everything is as neutral and objective as possible, so that you're not subconsciously biasing or influencing the participants in any way. And that's really, really hard to do when you're the one who has actually created the document or created the product. I know when I have tried to go and user test documents that I have written, it's incredibly hard to remain objective. And it's just, it's not always worth the effort because you don't want to accidentally bias your participants and end up with results that aren't really accurate. So it's much better to be able to have someone who's kind of one step removed, who doesn't have as much kind of personal stake in the design or the document itself, in order to kind of get that more objective stance. And then finally, obviously, as writers, we have the skills to write a well-written test plan, script, and scenarios. Choosing the right words is incredibly important, again, because you want to remain unbiased. You want to make sure the scenarios don't lead your users in any way. And you want to make sure you have a friendly, welcoming, and slightly informal tone to keep them comfortable. And you also need to make sure that the script is easy to read for the moderator. All of these things are incredibly important to running an effective usability test. So when it comes to writing specifically the script for the moderator and the scenarios for the participants, that can be extremely useful to have a technical writer be doing that, so that we can really pay attention to the words the way that we obviously know how to do. So what about usability testing your documentation? There are several ways that you can do this depending on your goals. The first way, and actually the easiest way, especially if your company's already decided to invest in usability testing, is actually to provide your documentation alongside the product during usability tests. This is where the moderator can say, here's the documentation for this product. If you are not sure where to go or what to do, you can open this documentation and use it to try to find the answer. This helps in two ways. So it gives the participants somewhere to go if they don't know what to do. So it can lessen their frustration levels during the process. And it gives them a place to kind of type in their questions where they're not just asking the moderator questions that the moderator can't answer for them. It gives you anecdotal data about how the users navigate and use the documentation. It's not truly a test of the documentation since they're not performing any tasks inside your help, but it can give you valuable qualitative feedback. And the drawback is that they might not ever open the help, and that's okay, but it's certainly better than nothing when you get this kind of feedback. Another type of usability test that you can run specifically on documentation is a findability or read and locate test. So this is something that is looking to test the high-level information architecture of the entire document and the formatting of individual topics. So these tasks are generally very straightforward. You're asking users to find the answers to questions that real users might need to know when they're using the product. And basically, they just have to kind of go through the documentation until they find the answer. And you can see, how they do that. Do they go to the TOC first? Do they go to the search first? How do they search through the TOC? How do they search through an individual topic? So these tasks are usually timed, which gives you primarily quantitative results. And it also can track where users go to find the information, what search terms they use, what TOC entries they click on, that kind of thing. And it can give you qualitative feedback about how either frustrated they are trying to find information and what about that frustrates them, or how easy they find it is to get that information. Understandability tests are slightly different. So these test how easily people can read and understand concepts and how easily they can pull the main points out of a piece of documentation. So this is generally for content that's more robust than, say, procedures or material lists. It's usually for something that's kind of explaining in detail conceptual information. So generally, I would do this on something like a get started topic or a concepts topic that's giving people all of that ramp up information that they need to know before they can dive into using the product. So these tasks usually instruct users to read a section of a document and then ask them to answer questions about the concepts in that document. And this can also be really helpful if you want to know how skimmable your content is for a specific topic. Because when you ask the questions about the concepts in the document, you can allow the participants to refer back to the doc when they're answering the questions. And then in your results, you would know whether they need to refer back to it at all, if they did refer back to it, how quickly they were able to find the information, and things like that. And this basically can provide a lot of insight into the way you have your topic organized, the paragraph structure you've used, the headings you've chosen, and the formatting choices you have to kind of understand how people are really processing the topic in front of them. For performance tests, these test procedures to see how accurate they are and how easily users can follow them. So the tasks generally give the users a specific procedure or a specific set of written instructions and ask them to complete that procedure within the product by following word for word what it says in the documentation. So the results here can tell you if you've got missteps, where you need to put more directions. So you might have a button that people are having trouble finding, and it would help if you put in the top left corner, select the go button or something like that. If there's extraneous information that could be removed that they skip right over or that they get confused by, and where you might want to put in tips or important notes that might be useful. So all of these things are kind of go above and beyond the technical accuracy of the procedure, right? Because, you know, if your procedure has been tech reviewed by a UX designer and a PO and possibly development, you shouldn't have any UI elements missing, but there might be a step where, okay, I need to make sure that users know to write down this number so they have it later on another screen. Or I need to make sure users know they need to save that document so that they can upload it later in a different place. And that might not be something that people think about until they're actually using the product and trying to follow the procedure word for word. And finally, we have safety testing. So this is typically for hardware documentation, especially for something that might be dangerous if not done correctly. For example, something in the manufacturing world. This should test to make sure that no instructions cause users to do something unsafe. So basically it will tell you if you need to add extra safety notes or if the current safety notes you have are sufficient. So, you know, it's not causing them to take a step back into something that could be dangerous or causing them to connect two wires in a way that might cause an electrocution problem or something like that. All right, so once you know you want to do a usability test and you know what type of usability test you want to do, how do you actually plan and run one? First, you need to make sure you have a kickoff with your subject matter experts to determine the goals. So this is probably going to include your UX designer and your PO at minimum. It might also include representatives from services or business management or whoever else is kind of a stakeholder in driving the product. And these goals are really important because they're going to help inform which users you're targeting, which type of test you should run, the scenarios you choose. Basically, you want everything to tie back to those goals. They should be specific enough that you have a direction for the test, but not so specific that they're tied to, say, a single scenario, because you want to make sure you're using your participants' time effectively. Then you want to actually write down a test plan. So this will identify on paper who your target users are, how you'll recruit participants, and the methods that you'll use. And we'll go into, in the next slide, a little bit more detail on what actually makes up the test plan. Then you can begin recruiting participants and scheduling study sessions. I often do this before I get into the nuts and bolts of the script and scenarios, simply because it takes a lot of time. And if you wait until you're completely done with the script and scenarios, you can end up kind of stretching the process out longer than it needed to be. So you want to make sure that you're getting those participants, getting the study session scheduled so you can actually hold that user test and that you didn't do all of this work planning it and writing it for nothing. Then write the moderator's script, which includes all instructions that the moderator needs, and the scenarios, which should include the goals, the pass criteria for the scenario, and any other necessary information. Then you want to make sure you conduct a practice session. So this is where ideally you would get a participant who is as close to your user group as possible, but if you don't have an extra participant to spare, you could certainly do this with someone on your team or someone else at your company who's unfamiliar with the user test, just to make sure basically there's no problems with the user test. And it gives the moderator a chance to practice setting everything up, walking through their instructions, going through the script with a live participant in front of them. And then, you know, you want to make sure, for example, that a scenario isn't written in a way that is confusing so that the participant doesn't understand what you're asking them to do. Because that could mean that you end up with a failed scenario that isn't actually the product or document's fault. It's the fault of the way the scenario was written. And again, that's kind of not using your participants' time or your time effectively. So after you run the practice session, if you need to make any adjustments to the test, you should do that. If you don't have to make any adjustments to the test and the practice session went off perfectly, and the participant that you used is actually one of your real users, then you can actually include those results in your final study results. If you had to change the test or you weren't able to use a real user, you should not use those results. You should just kind of toss them off to the side. That was just for a practice to make sure you had everything set up and ready to go for your real users. Then obviously you need to conduct the study sessions. take notes and gather results. And this is a separate item because the moderator should never be taking notes during the study session. Either you should be recording the session so the moderator can go back afterwards and take notes off of that, or you should have someone observing the session in another room so that they can take notes while it's going on without the moderator being distracted by that. Finally, you'll analyze your results and make recommendations for the areas of improvement, as well as the areas that are working well, and debrief those results with stakeholders so that you can knowledge transfer the problems that were discovered and get the fixes for those recommendations prioritized on the roadmap. This is a really important step that sometimes gets dropped. And what you'll see happen sometimes is people conduct a usability test, they find out what the problems are, they make the recommendations, and then nothing ever really happens with them because, features that are being asked for by customers end up overruling, and taking up the time of the development team and the PO. But if you have a formal sit down and say, when and where can we get these prioritized on the roadmap, it's much easier to get those changes implemented so that you can actually have an effect based on what you were testing. All right, so now we're going to talk about the actual writing that goes into a usability test, and there's quite a lot of it. And this is, again, technical writers can come in and provide a lot of value. So your test plans should include the goals that we just talked about that you defined with your stakeholders and your SMEs. It should include how you will recruit and screen participants, and your test method. So the test method includes the type of test that we just talked about before, the length of the study sessions, and a description of how the test will be conducted. So will it be in person or remote? How will everything be set up for each of those scenarios? Whether the test will be recorded, how the notes will be taken, and then instructions for any circumstances that might come up. So these are kind of instructions for usually either the moderator or the person who is aggregating the results. So what should the moderator do if users get stuck and frustrated and don't seem like they can finish a task? Or what should the moderator do if they ask questions? Or whether or not you include the pass criteria if they had to get help, or if they only made it through half of the pass criteria, how do you log that in the results? Then you would have the moderator instructions. So this includes any materials that the moderator needs, the instructions they need to get set up for the sessions, and then the full script, which should also include any instructions they need to perform during the session. And then the scenarios, which are usually, I find it's very useful to actually give the scenarios to the participant. Either you read them out loud or you provide them on paper or a digital copy. And then the goal of the scenario, which should be in support of the overall study goals, and the pass criteria. So what do the participants have to do in order to consider that scenario a pass? And then we're going to take a look now at the example test plan that I've written up. So this test plan is just kind of an example that you'll be able to use to adapt to any usability test that you want to run. And I wrote it on MadCap Flare as if we were going to be user testing MadCap Flare, because that's something that we all here should be familiar with. So basically, we've got our goals here at the top. We want to ensure that Flare's essential authoring functions are easy to learn for technical writers who have never used Flare before. So you can see how the essential authoring functions are kind of already giving direction to what scenarios we'll be including, and the technical writers that have never used Flare before are already informing who our participants are going to be. So down here, under recruiting and screening participants, we've identified our target user group. So we want to look for intermediate technical writers. And for recruiting, we've identified the places we're going to go to try to recruit our participants. So we're going to start with kind of all of our Flare access points, and then we'll also reach out because we want to find users who have little to no Flare experience. We're also going to reach out to the popular technical writer LinkedIn groups because we'll be more likely to find participants with no Flare experience there. Because we do have specific criteria, we are going to screen our participants and ask them to take a survey. And there's a couple of questions that assess their skill level as a technical writer and their level of skill with MadCap Flare. And we've got the eligibility criteria here. So basically, we want to make sure they've been a technical writer for less than 5 years and that they've never used MadCap Flare, or they've been using it for less than a year and they only use it monthly or rarely. And then it's always best if you can offer some kind of compensation for your participants, because it does, not only does it make sure that more people will sign up to be a participant, but it also ensures that people are less likely to cancel or be no-shows on you. If they're going to get something out of it, once it's scheduled, they're more likely to actually show up and do the user test. So here we've just kind of made up that the participants will be compensated with a free MadCap Flare intermediate training course. I've seen a lot of places where it's just, a $50 Amazon gift card, or, depending on how your product works, if it's a product that you're selling directly to consumers, you could offer them a free subscription or something like that. Anything basically that will provide value to your participants. So then we've got our test method. So we're going to make sure that this is a moderated test, in-person and remote sessions. So you'll see as we go through our script in a little bit, there are sections that deal with whether or not you are moderating in person or whether you're moderating remotely. It's probably going to take 45 to 60 minutes. That's important because we want to make sure, one, we schedule enough time with the participants, and two, we explain to them what the time commitment will be. And we want to make sure we get at least 6 participants, and I will be moderating. So here's kind of where we detail the test method. We're going to give them Flare 2021 R02. We'll provide a scenario and ask the participant to perform specific tasks. We'll ask them to think out loud. The moderator will be expected to ask follow-up questions to make sure that we understand the participant's reasoning for certain actions they're taking or comments they're making. And we do say that if they've stopped making progress, the moderator can instruct them to move on to the next scenario. We're also going to give them access to the MadCap Flare online help, like I mentioned earlier. And the moderator will tell them to use it if they're unsure what to do or where to go. So we will be able to get information about that as well. This is kind of talking about how we'll conduct some sessions in person or others via Zoom. So we'll use Zoom for the in-person sessions to record. And on remote sessions, we'll again be using Zoom, and we'll give the participant control of our mouse, and we'll suggest they bring a pen and paper ahead of time so that they can make notes if necessary. We're going to record the sessions, and then they'll be deleted when the study is over. And then at the end of the study session, we will be emailing the participant a system usability scale survey. So the system usability scale is a really interesting concept that I've got a link out to as part of this test plan, so you can read more about it. But basically, it's a series of questions that at the end of it, you can calculate how well your entire system performed, how usable your entire system is, basically. And then we're going to go into the moderator instructions. So we'll switch back over to the presentation while we talk about that. So for writing a script, there are a few things you want to make sure that you include, because you really want to make sure that the moderator is saying the exact same words in the exact same way to every participant. So there's no deviation and no kind of wondering whether or not the moderator going off script impacted any of the results. So the script should include a welcome and a purpose, should explain the moderator's role in the session and the participant's role in the session. It should state whether or not you're recording, and if you are recording, how you're going to handle that. Make sure you explain how usability testing works. And this is really important because most participants have never done a usability test before. So you want to emphasize a couple of things. You're testing the product, not them. There is no right or wrong answer, and you need honest feedback, so they shouldn't worry about hurting your feelings. People can get very stressed out in usability testing. They think that you know, they're going to do the wrong thing, or you're going to judge them, or they're going to make a mistake. So emphasizing these things in the script, and then again, if they, you know, verbalize that they're worried about that later on, is really important for setting them at ease. You also want to make sure that you explain how to think out loud, because that's, again, a little bit of a foreign concept to people usually. Make sure you give instructions for what to do if the participants have questions or get stuck. And make sure you explicitly ask if they have any questions for you, just to make sure you've got everything covered, they feel totally comfortable before you jump into the scenarios. And then at the end, make sure you script a closing where you're thanking the participant, asking them if they have any additional feedback, and then giving them instructions for completing a follow-up survey if there is one. So one thing to keep in mind before we go look at the example is that you should always make sure, in addition to, you know, just having someone in general peer review it for grammar and clarity and all of that, you should have someone read it out loud as though they are the moderator, to ensure that the words are not just correct, but also easy to say. So you don't want your moderator tripping over awkward wording or deciding halfway through the sessions that actually they want to say this a different way because it would be easier. Because you want them to be able to confidently read the script for the same experience for each participant. All right, so in our test plan here, we've got the moderator instructions. It lists out everything they need. So we've got a printed copy of the moderator instructions, a copy of experience, either printed out or digital, and the MadCap Flare online help, a Flare project with the specific usability study project open, Zoom, and a mouse if you're conducting things in person. And then we've got the script. So there's a key here. Black text is what the moderator is actually going to be speaking out loud. Blue italicized text gives them instructions for what to do. So there's instructions here for how to set up the computer. Make sure you're telling them to snooze all the notifications and close anything that they might find distracting. Basically anything that's not related to the usability test. So then you've got the introduction here. So we're, you know, greeting them, telling them thanks for helping us, explaining who we are as the moderator and what the expectations are, so that it's going to take about 45 to 60 minutes and that we're recording. Then we're explaining what the purpose of the study is. We're asking people to try using Flare so we can get feedback, and then explaining what's going to happen. So I'm going to give you some scenarios and ask you to use Flare the way you would if you were working on your own. Again, making sure you're explaining how usability testing works. And then we're emphasizing we're testing the user interface, not you. Nothing you do is wrong. You can take as much time as you need. Don't worry that you're going to hurt our feelings. We want your honest feedback. So again, making sure you're really emphasizing those points. And then explaining while you're working, please think out loud, explain why you're making certain choices. Tell me if there's anything you find confusing. If you have questions, please ask them. I might not be able to answer them because we want to see how intuitive the UI is. So that goes back to the test method where we said we didn't want the moderator to answer any questions. But let them know that we are going to have the opportunity at the end to answer any questions that they still have. And let them know that if they get stuck, let the moderator know, and we'll move on to the next scenario. And then the explicit call here for questions before they get started. And then you can see we've got one set of instructions for if the participant is in person and another if the participant is remote, because what the moderator needs to say or do does need to be a little bit different depending on the context. So basically we're just kind of explaining to them where they need to go on the computer. So we're giving them control of the mouse. They've got the Flare project up. This is where the Flare online help is. And then they hand them the scenario and ask them to read it out loud. Again, I find it really useful not just to have the moderator read the scenario out loud, but hand the participant the scenario so that they can refer back to it later on. We've got some information here about what the moderator should do while the participant is working on the scenarios. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later. And then after the scenarios are complete, we've got a post-test question to ask them, how easy it was to use Flare and why. And then we, again, thank them for helping us, ask them if they have any other feedback or questions, and then let them know that we're going to be sending them that survey via email, so they can do that on their own time after we're done. All right. So that's pretty much everything you need to keep in mind when you're writing a script. Next, we're going to talk about writing the scenarios. So the most important thing about the scenarios is you want them to be clear and concise. They need to describe the end goal that the participants need to complete, but not the method for getting there. So this is really important because you don't want to tell the user what to do. You want to see if they can figure out how to do the action. And it can be a little bit tricky to figure out how to word that, so you're not just saying, you know, click here and add a snippet, but instead describing, you know, what the actual goal is. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. You also want to explain the why behind the goal, because the participant is more likely to be invested in the scenario and less likely to get frustrated and want to move on if they know why they're doing the specific task that you're asking them to do. Make sure that you're writing in the user's language and avoid the terms used in the UI. So this is kind of twofold, right? We always want to make sure we're writing in the user's language so that they understand what we're talking about. However, even if your UI uses the user's language, you do want to try to avoid the actual terms of, say, the buttons or the options that they're selecting or things like that, because that can prime them, right? For example, if you have a scenario that talks about micro content and you have a button that says create micro content, the users might only find that because you gave them the word micro content in the scenario, and that can, you know, impact the results in a way that you might not realize. Also, make sure you have a clear end to the task. The participants should know when they're done. And then make sure you're paying attention to the order of the scenarios. So there's a couple of things that go into this. The most important is that you want to make sure that the first scenario doesn't prime the participants for a later one. So that, you know, they often build on each other so that you're kind of, you know, creating a narrative of first you do this and then you do this and then you do that. But even if you're not doing that, you want to make sure that you're not sending them to a place where they'll already see how to complete a later scenario while they're completing an earlier one, because that will, again, impact your results in a way you won't really be able to quantify. You also want to make sure, as I mentioned in the script, we do want the participants to take as much time as they need. So you should be paying attention to how long it takes to complete each scenario and planning for that when you're choosing how many scenarios to include. And that's something that you can get a little bit more insight on in your practice run of the study session. But basically, there's always a chance that your last scenario or two you might not get to. So you should also try to make sure you prioritize the more important scenarios first. So we're going to look at a couple of examples here now. So here we've got our scenario 1, which is fairly straightforward. And that can be useful if you can to put a more straightforward scenario first so that the participant can get comfortable with the product, comfortable with the moderator, comfortable with the whole situation without, you know, needing to get too stressed out. So basically we're saying your new project needs the company's glossary added to it. So that's our why. And then your team already has a Flare project with the original glossary file set up. And you need to pull the glossary file into this project so that the entries display in the search results. So essentially you can see based on the goal, we want to know if people can easily import a file from their team's global project to their local project. But we're not using the word import anywhere in this scenario. We are, however, using another word that technical writers use very often, which is pull something into something else. So we're still using the user's language without using a UI element name. And then we've got the goal here, the pass criteria. So it says where they need to go and then what they need to do once they get there. And then we have a post scenario follow-up question that we want the moderator to ask. So then in scenario 2, we're telling them to specifically open a topic, and then they need to remove everything because it's been pulled from their release, or remove everything in a specific section, which is something I think we can all relate to, happens all the time. And we want them to make sure that they remove it from the output while leaving it in the topic so that they can easily add it back in the future. Again, something that's very, very common in technical writing. So essentially, we want to know, can they understand that conditions are the best way to do this? And can they find the condition set in order to apply a future condition to that section of the topic? But again, we didn't use the word condition or mark as future or anything else that would prime them for how to do that, because our user group is intermediate technical writers who should be familiar with this kind of concept and this kind of scenario, but have never used Flare before. So they might not know that Flare uses the word conditions for this concept. So again, we've got our goal, pass criteria, and the follow-up question. The last one I'm going to look at here is the micro content one. So basically, sorry, this is not micro content. The previous one was. This was about snippet conditions and snippet variables. So we're telling them to open a specific topic. We're telling them that there is a snippet already set up for a specific field because it's used in multiple topics, but you need to change some of them to optional instead of required. Again, a very familiar scenario to all of us, I'm sure. And we're asking them to use single sourcing, so kind of the high level concept, to continue using the snippet, but making sure that it displays as optional in one topic and required in another. So again, this gives them a very clear ending to the scenario. When they've got it showing up as optional on one and required on another, that's their ending point. And this one is a little bit more involved. You can see the pass criteria is actually 2 different ways that they can do this, because they could do it with a snippet condition or a snippet variable. And there's a lot more steps here. So this is the last scenario. So it's the scenario they might spend the most time on. And it is the scenario they might not get to if the others take a long time, which is okay. So yeah, that's pretty much everything about how to write scenarios. The biggest thing to remember is just that you need to balance the specific details that the participants need to understand with keeping it general enough that you don't lead them to the answer. That's kind of the balance you have to find. Second to last slide here is the best practices for moderating. So again, as a member of the product team who's a little bit more objective about the design and the requirements, you might also be a great person to actually be the moderator for these tests. So you want to make sure you practice ahead of time, rehearse everything out loud, rehearse setting up your computer, rehearse setting up the recording, the webcam, the Zoom, everything that you need. Make sure you know how to set it up seamlessly. Always arrive early and set up the technology before the session starts so that you're not wasting any of the participants' time with setting everything up and making sure that your technology is working. Treat the participant respectfully. So make sure they're comfortable if they're going to be coming in person. Make sure you stay within the allotted time. Don't go over your time. Make sure you're dressing professionally, and don't take notes as the moderator. We kind of already touched on that a little bit. Provide a safe space. So again, as I said, they tend to be a little bit stressed because it's something that's unfamiliar to them. They're afraid they're going to make a mistake or be judged. So you just want to provide that safe space by being friendly, warm up with a little bit of neutral conversation before you starting on the script. Reaffirm that there's no wrong answers, and always express gratitude for their time. Follow the script. Again, reading the script word for word, maintaining consistency between sessions is really important. We've kind of already gone over that. Listen more and speak less. So you want to encourage the participant to think out loud, prompt them if they've been quiet for a few minutes, but be an active listener and speak only when you need to clarify something. Maintain neutrality. So this is, again, that objectivity and neutrality that we want to stay with so that we're not influencing the participant. Make sure you use a calm tone and non-leading words, and think about putting on your poker face. And using non-leading words seems very simple, but it's really easy to respond to someone by saying, okay, great. That's something that I do all the time and I have to train myself out of when I'm moderating. Because you don't want to make it seem like they did the right thing or the wrong thing. You just want to maintain that neutrality. Clarify by asking open questions. So follow up if you're not sure about something the participant says. So if they say like, I don't get this, or I'm confused by this, confirm what they're actually confused by or what they mean by saying, I don't get this. Refocus the participant if necessary. So if they wander away from the task, which happens more than you might think, a great way to refocus them is to ask them why
Sorry, Leah, I just wanted to interrupt for just a moment, Leah. I'm so sorry. I think we have a little bit of an audio modulation problem. I don't know if anybody else can hear me.
Frustration for using their body. It is up to move on to the next thing.
So I think we're having a little bit of an audio modulation problem, everybody. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to give it
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I think we had a little bit of a
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you now. We had a little internet clog there, I think is what happened. So I think we left off, maybe Leah, if you could repeat right up to, I think we kind of lost, I think we lost audio in and around know when to move on. So if you could perhaps repeat that bullet down, that would be great.
Okay.
Apologies, Leah. Yeah, we had a little bit of a modulation issue there. So yeah, let's say give an offering to the internet gods and goddesses here.
That's okay. Absolutely, yeah. So for no one to move on, basically just make sure you're paying attention to the participant's level of frustration based on their words and their body language. So if it stops being productive, move on to the next scenario. And then finally, we have Steve Krug's Thing the Therapist Would Say, and this actually links out to the document. It's a great resource of open-ended, neutral, friendly questions that you can just kind of keep in your back pocket when participants are not thinking out loud, they're not talking, and you want to kind of prompt them and draw out more information from them. And finally, you need to analyze the results. So basically, you want to make sure when you're analyzing the results that you report on both observations, which are comments made by the participant or actions that they took, and measurements, which is that quantitative data we talked about. Make sure you're only reporting on trends. And a trend is anything that at least 3 people said, did, or encountered. As I said earlier, even 3 people doing or saying or encountering the same thing is enough to establish a behavioral pattern that can be extrapolated to a larger user group. However, when you're reporting on these trends, don't use percentages. It's more important to make sure that your stakeholders understand why usability testing with 6 to 8 people or even 5 people provides valuable information than to mislead them about the number of participants by, for example, saying 75% of participants found this task difficult when it's actually 4 people, right? It sounds very different, and you don't want to accidentally mislead people by using the percentage. Make sure when you're making recommendations, you identify critical versus major versus minor problems, which helps with that prioritization in the roadmap. Critical problems are usually defined as things that stop the user from completing the task entirely. Major problems usually are things that take them too long to complete the task. So for example, this means that users who are not being paid to do the task or compensated to be there would probably abandon it. And then minor problems are annoyances that might bother people, but it doesn't stop them or significantly delay them. Your recommendations should also tie back to the goals and the scenarios. And then make sure you're not being prescriptive. So especially if you as the technical writer are the one conducting the usability test and analyzing the results, you want to make sure you're pointing out the problem and pointing out a non-prescriptive way of fixing it. So if people have trouble finding a button, say that we need to make the button more visible. And then it's the UX designer's job to determine how we make that button more visible, rather than you saying in your recommendation, we should make it green. Because there's nothing in the usability test that says this making it green is going to make it better. But you can say the usability test showed we need to make it more visible. And you'll see a lot of the research on usability testing shows you writing a bunch of reports, and that's great if people will read them. In my experience, people don't read them, and presentations are the most effective way to give those results to stakeholders. So you want to make sure you include a breakdown of the participants, walk through the results of each task and what you ask participants to do, make sure you outline the key problems and your recommendations, include some verbatim quotes if interesting, and also include the system usability scale score if you did that. So that's essentially everything that you need to know at a high level about usability testing. I hope that this was helpful enough to kind of get you started if it's something that you've never really dipped your toe in before. And I can hand it back off to Jen.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. That was so interesting, and apologies there for that audio issue, everyone. Once in a while that happens, unfortunately. Just want to remind everybody, we just have a couple questions. It looks like, you know, we've got a lot of folks that are really interested in this subject. So just, I know we don't have too much time, but I do want to remind everybody that through the August 31st, there is a buy 3, get 1 free promotion. So that includes any new licenses of Flare, MadCap Central, or the entire AMS. So if you have some questions about this, or if you're looking to grow your team, now's a really good time because it's a good value. So get in touch with sales at madcapsoftware.com or contact your sales rep, and they'd be happy to get you more details on this promotion through the end of August. Okay, just maybe a couple things, Leah. There were a couple questions. We were kind of hanging on every word. We lost audio there, but there was a couple questions on. Can you go back and kind of? It was right before you switched to the prior to analyze the results. You were talking about ways to refocus the participant and what happens there. Yeah, so I think it was on the so can you talk to us a little bit, maybe just spend a minute or two, like techniques for refocusing the participant if needed, and what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times participants can actually wander off task and end up in, especially if you're doing a summative test on a working product, they can end up somewhere that you had no intention of them going. So if that happens, a great way to refocus them is to ask them why they're doing what they're doing. And if you kind of keep asking why a couple of times, eventually they usually return to the scenario and say, well, because, and then they look at the scenario and go, oh, actually, it's not asking me to do that. And then they'll just kind of refocus themselves. So it's a great kind of neutral, friendly, non-judgmental way to do that.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of ties into the next bullet point too. Like you could kind of segue into like, you know, redirecting and keeping some of the usability goals in mind if those tangents happen, I suppose. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this was great. A couple other questions came in. Folks are wondering if they're able to get their hands at all. Will we be able to share that sample test plan or that sample Word document you were looking at? I know you were just using Flare as an example, but that might be kind of a nice blueprint for people, and wondering if we could perhaps share that with the participants today.
Yes, absolutely. I wrote it with the intention of sending it out as part of the materials.
Oh, fantastic.
So I want people to be able to take that and use it as a template.
Fantastic. That's going to be great. So yeah, for everybody that's on the call, thanks so much. Again, apologies for the audio, but we'll be compiling all this for everybody and including this wonderful deck and that Word doc that Leah has put together just so you can use it as a blueprint. So, well, with that, I think we're right at the top of the hour. So we'll go ahead and thank everybody for attending today. Really appreciate everyone's engagement and questions and participation. And thank you, Leah, for putting this together. I think this is really important stuff, great concept, and we're so honored that you took the time to put this all together and present it to us today. So very well done. Thank you so much. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us and spending this hour. And so we hope to see you on another presentation or another training soon. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week. So take care, everyone.